It was a dark and stormy night, as it often is, and a weary traveler had made his way along wet and winding roads in the hills of South Carolina to a small town called Greenwood, where he stood before a small group of rain-soaked skeptics. This group of 20 or so people had come to see what he was all about. They'd come wanting to know if this young politician from Illinois had what it would take to make good on his promises. If he had what it would take to lead with integrity and to serve with humility. Fairly new to the national stage, the young man had come looking for any support that he could get. Tired and groggy from weeks on the campaign trail, the hopeful candidate walked into the room with not a lot left in his tank. Tense and distracted from driving through the rain for almost 2 hours in the hills of South Carolina, he didn't have a lot of energy to muster. Until he heard the voice of Miss Edith Childs. As a key figure in her community, Miss Childs offered up her well-known chant to the small group of folks gathered in that room. The community members knew. They knew how to respond to Miss Childs when she said, "Fired up." And they knew how to reply when she asked if they were ready to go. The group grew louder and louder with each repetition until even the tired young senator found himself fired up and ready to go. And from that fateful, dark, and stormy night on, Ms. Childs' rallying cry would continue to echo throughout the rest of Obama's first presidential campaign, triggering waves of support that would carry him all the way to the White House. Miss Childs' zeal was contagious. Now, outside of crossword puzzles and maybe a Scrabble game, zeal is not a word that we come across very often. When you ask someone how they're feeling, I'm willing to bet that zealous is probably not the response that you're going to get. It's not a word that we use very often. But it's a spirit that we can recognize. It's a spirit that we're seeing more and more of these days as people keep showing up and speaking out and marching forward on everything from health care to care for the environment and everything in between. Zeal is the spirit that's behind of movement and the power of people to bring about change in their world. It's the spirit that we see of women breaking the silence of sexual harassment and discrimination and assault. It's the strength of high school students calling on legislatures to address the issue of gun violence. And it's the solidarity of teachers advocating for reasonable salaries. And it's Jesus, standing in the temple with a whip in his hand, scattering the coins and driving out the money changers and turning the whole system inside out. Zeal. It's not a word we hear very often, but it's a spirit that we can recognize. It's not often a word that we use to describe Jesus, and yet looking back on this moment, the disciples would remember the words of the psalmist that said, "How zeal for your house consumes me." This zealous Jesus is startling and a little bit strange because it's not a side of Jesus that we see very often. We're used to seeing Jesus as the self-conscious miracle worker who tells people to be quiet when he heals them. Or we're comfortable with Jesus as the thoughtful lecturer, teaching and feeding the multitudes and telling provocative, if not humorous, parables. And we like Jesus as the cool and collected calmer of storms. We know these images of Jesus well. But the one we find in today's gospel reading is strange, if not a little bit unsettling. But outside of the Passion narrative, this story of Jesus clearing the temple with a whip in hand is one of only a handful of stories found in all 4 of the Gospels. So it's worth paying attention to. But like many of the shared stories in the Gospels, each writer tells it from a slightly different perspective, from their own unique vantage point and from their particular confession of Christ. Today's version comes to us from the Gospel of John, which differs from the Synoptic Gospels in a couple of significant and really interesting ways. The first notable difference is where it comes in the larger narrative of Jesus' ministry. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have Jesus clearing the temple after he enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. For them, this outburst of Jesus is the impetus for the religious leaders to arrest him and ultimately execute him. For them, this is Jesus' last public proclamation before he's silenced by the powers that be. For them, this is the climactic conclusion to his ministry. But that's not what we find in John. If you remember, our scripture from this morning comes from what chapter? 2. Very good. You can look. This is open notes. It comes from chapter 2, right at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, right after he called a few disciples and he turned water into wine at the wedding in Cana. Instead of triggering the events that would lead to his crucifixion, instead of his last public proclamation, Jesus clearing the temple in John's gospel is his first public display of authority. Coming at the very beginning of his ministry, this event sets the stage for establishing Christ as a radical new way of experiencing God. See, from the very beginning, John declares that Jesus is the incarnate Word of God. From the beginning was the Word. So it makes sense for Jesus to go to the temple to declare his authority and set the tone for everything that would come after. Because you see, the temple was more than just the center of Jewish religious life. It was more than a religious center. It was the heart and soul of Israel's identity as God's chosen people. It was God's dwelling place, a physical presence and a constant reminder that God was present with them. And in Jesus' day, when the gospel is taking place, the temple also had some political strings attached to it. King Herod had greatly expanded the Temple Mount and carried out a huge 46-year rebuilding project. No, thank you. He did all of this to curry favor with the chief religious leaders. This was in Jesus' day. But John, the writer of John, is writing at a time when the temple had been destroyed. And the Jewish people no longer had that physical center to anchor them as God's people. But as God's incarnate Word, Jesus is the new center, according to John. As the way, the truth, and the life, Jesus provides access to God through his life, his death, and his resurrection. This is what it means for Jesus to clear the temple at the beginning. But another significant difference between John's account and that of the Synoptic Gospels is what Jesus says as he drives out those money changers. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah saying, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of thieves or robbers." Yes. Here, Jesus' rebuke seems to suggest that the people engaged in exchanging the currency and selling the animals for sacrifice are cheating the throngs of pilgrims that are coming through, who've come from all over the empire to Jerusalem to offer sacrifice. And when Jesus directly addresses the pigeon sellers, it suggests that Jesus is angered by the exploitation of the poor, who would only have been able to afford the smallest of sacrifices. This makes sense considering how Jesus routinely called out the exploitation of other less than honorable economic practices throughout his ministry. But there's no mention of thieves or robbers in John's account. Instead, when Jesus faces the pigeon sellers, after turning over the tables and scattering the coins of the money changers, he commands them to take all of this out of here and to stop turning God's house into a market. By using this more general term for market, the issue isn't so much about whether or not the money changers and dove sellers were charging fair prices. In John, the problem is the system itself. The problem was this transactional nature of religious participation. The problem was that forgiveness and closeness to God came at a price and was sold to the highest bidder. So Jesus kicks the market out of the temple. And by kicking the market out of the temple, Jesus was turning over more than just tables. He was turning the whole system inside out. Jesus was truly the first Baptist, advocating for the separation of church and state. By kicking out the market from the temple, Jesus was reasserting the power of sacred space and holy ground as a place that operates differently from the markets of the world. Where the markets go up and down at the slightest provocation, sacred space provides us with a sense of stability. Where the market is all about making as much money as possible, sacred space calls us to consider the needs of others. Where the market assigns an arbitrary value to everything and everyone, sacred space reminds us that we are all God's beloved children and that all of creation belongs to God. In the market, there's little room for community to take root. But in sacred space, community can flourish. And sometimes we're lucky enough to find these sacred spaces in actual physical locations. Hopefully, we get a taste of it when we come to church or when we stumble upon a beautiful landscape. We can enter sacred space in the stillness of a quiet room or feel it in the sound of a crowded concert hall. Because sacred space is all around us because we carry it with us in our bodies. You see, Jesus goes a step farther than just kicking the market out of the temple. When the temple authorities asked Jesus to give them a sign to justify what he had just done, he responds with this: "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. This does not impress the temple authorities. Yeah, right, they say. It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you say you're going to raise it in 3 days. What kind of fool do you take us for? But thankfully, the gospel writer steps in and explains how the temple that Jesus was speaking of was his body. Granted, the followers wouldn't only realize this after the resurrection. But this is a radical relocation of the temple. Jesus didn't just kick the market out of the temple, he relocated the heart of the temple. Relocated God's very presence from the massive physical structure of the temple complex to the flesh and blood of his own body. And this is a powerful statement of how we can experience God and how we can live out God's love for all of God's people. By watching how Jesus' ministry unfolds from this zealous beginning, and by seeing how Jesus made God's presence real for those he met, we learn how the most sacred of spaces can be the ones that exist between us. Christ teaches us that we all have the power to make God's love real in the spaces between us when we seek to understand one another, when we humble our hearts and we listen with open minds, when we overcome our fear and reach across those spaces that divide us. Living God's love for all of God's people means being zealous for something more than business as usual. It means following Christ and creating sacred spaces where community can flourish. And it means being fired up and ready to go wherever the Spirit may lead. Amen.